He was just 14 years old, barely 5 feet tall, so light that the electric chair had to be modified to fit his tiny frame. On June 16, 1944, George Stinney Jr. was executed by the state of South Carolina. He was the youngest person in modern American history to be legally put to death. The brutal murder of 2 young white girls in a racially segregated town, torn by fear, prejudice, and silence. There was no lawyer present during his interrogation, no signed confession, no physical evidence. And the trial, it lasted barely a day. The jury, all white, deliberated for just 10 minutes. 80 years later, one haunting question remains. Did the state of South Carolina execute an innocent child? George Junius Stinney Jr. lived in the tiny mill town of Alcolu, South Carolina, a place split down the middle by railroad tracks. On one side, white families. On the other, black families like the Stinneys. George was the second youngest of 5 children. His father worked at the local sawmill. His mother tended the home. George went to school, played with his siblings, and rode his bicycle around their modest neighborhood. He was small for his age, thin, with large, watchful eyes that seemed to absorb the world around him. He loved drawing, loved helping his older brother with chores. His teachers called him respectful, but quiet. His friends remembered him as kind. And on the afternoon of March 23, 1944, he was simply outside with his little sister, picking wildflowers near a pasture. That same day, 2 young white girls, Betty June Binnicker, age 11, and Mary Emma Thames, age 7, never returned home after going out to ride their bicycles. The next morning, their bodies were found in a shallow ditch, their skulls crushed. And by nightfall, George Stinney Jr., just 14, a black child in Jim Crow South, was in handcuffs. But why George? What could possibly have led authorities to zero in on a child within hours of a murder? Spring in Alcolu, 1944, meant sweltering air and the faint hum of sawmill machinery echoing through pine trees. The town was a patchwork of shacks and modest homes surrounded by fields and dirt paths. Life moved slowly, but it moved on 2 very different tracks, literally and figuratively. On one side of the railroad tracks lived the white workers, with wooden porches, painted fences, and a community center. On the other side, the black families lived in smaller, weathered homes, often with outhouses and no electricity. Schools were segregated. Churches were segregated. Justice, too, was segregated. Alcolu wasn't just a town. It was a hierarchy carved into geography. Children knew not to cross certain streets after dark. Adults knew when to keep their heads down and their voices quiet. When Betty June and Mary Emma disappeared, a quiet panic gripped the white side of town. Search parties were formed before sunset. Flashlights cut through the trees. Parents locked their doors. The next morning, a group of locals discovered the girls' bodies near a ditch behind the black section of town. Their bicycles lay nearby. A rusted railroad spike, possibly the murder weapon, was found partially buried in the mud. And then came the silence, the kind of silence that screams. Within hours, sheriff's deputies arrived at the Stinney home. George and his little sister had reportedly spoken to the girls earlier that day, briefly, as they passed by, looking for flowers. That alone, that one moment, made him a suspect. George was taken away without a warrant. No one informed his parents. No lawyer was present. He would never see his family again outside of a courtroom. The town buzzed with whispers. Some neighbors believed he was innocent. Others simply believed he fit the description of what white fear looked like in 1944: young, poor, and black. The question loomed: was this a pursuit of justice or a performance of it? It was the afternoon of March 23rd, 1944. The sun hung low over Alcolu, casting long shadows across the red dirt roads. Betty June Binnicker and Mary Emma Thames, ages 11 and 7, had been seen riding their bicycles through the white part of town earlier that day. They were looking for flowers, a simple errand turned tragic. At one point, the 2 girls crossed the railroad tracks into the black neighborhood. That's where they reportedly encountered George Stinney Jr. and his younger sister, Aim, according to Amy. The girls asked where they could find maypops, a wildflower that grew in the nearby fields. George and Amy answered politely. The encounter lasted barely a minute. Later that evening, when the girls didn't return home, panic spread quickly. White volunteers searched through the night. The girls were found the next morning, lying in a shallow, muddy ditch near an old sawmill close to the black side of town. Their skulls had been crushed. Betty June suffered at least 7 blows to the head. Mary Emma's injuries were fewer, but just as fatal. A discarded piece of metal, possibly a railroad spike or a heavy bolt, was later suggested as the murder weapon. There were no eyewitnesses, no fingerprints, no forensic evidence, but by evening, George Stinney was under arrest. What happened next was swift and irreversible. George was questioned alone, without his parents, without a lawyer. What he allegedly told deputies remains unclear. Some reports claim he confessed, others say he denied everything. The original confession, if one ever existed, has been lost. No signed statement has ever been recovered. The trial came barely a month later. It lasted just 1 day. The courtroom was packed with white townsfolk. George, too small to reach the table, had to sit on a stack of books. His appointed lawyer, a political hopeful, called no witnesses. He conducted no cross-examinations. The prosecution presented their case based on a single supposed confession. The jury, 12 white men, deliberated for 10 minutes. Guilty. George was sentenced to die in the electric chair. He reportedly asked the guards afterward, "Why do they want to kill me for something I didn't do?" He was 14 years old. The investigation into the deaths of Betty June Binnicker and Mary Emma Thames began with urgency, but not with care. There was no crime scene tape, no chain of custody, no formal forensic procedure. The girls' bodies were removed from the ditch and buried quickly. No autopsy was performed before the trial. The so-called murder weapon, a piece of iron allegedly found nearby, was never officially tested or presented in court. From the start, the focus wasn't on how the murders happened. It was on who could be blamed. And George Stinney Jr. became that person. The sheriff's office claimed George had confessed to the killings, saying he had lured the girls into the woods, attacked them with a metal object, and attempted to hide their bodies. But the confession was never signed. It wasn't recorded. And George's family, including his sister Amy, who was with him during the girls' visit, was never called to testify. Years later, Amy would speak publicly, insisting that she was with George all afternoon, that he could not have left her side long enough to commit such a brutal act, let alone carry 2 bodies through a field undetected. No blood-stained clothing was ever found. No fingerprints were lifted. No eyewitnesses placed George at the scene of the crime beyond that brief, innocent encounter. And yet, that was enough. In a town gripped by racial tension and still governed by the codes of segregation. No one questioned whether a 14-year-old black boy could physically commit such a crime, or why no other suspects were ever investigated. There were whispers that a prominent white family's relative had been involved, but those rumors never made it into the official record. In Alcolu, 1944, certain truths were never written down, and so, the strongest piece of evidence, the only thing that tied George Stinney to the murders, was a confession the public never saw, spoken by a scared child, behind closed doors, without a single adult on his side. April 24, 1944, less than 1 month after the murders. George Stinney Jr. was led into the Clarendon County Courthouse in chains. He wore an oversized shirt and trousers clothes too large for his small, thin frame. He was shackled, even though he barely weighed 95 pounds. He sat alone at the defense table, separated from his family and the community that had already condemned him in silence. His court-appointed lawyer, Charles Plowden, was a tax attorney with no experience in capital cases. He never challenged the confession. He never cross-examined the prosecution's 3 witnesses, all white, all law enforcement. He never called George's sister, Amy, who had the alibi that could have changed everything. Plowden also failed to request a change of venue despite clear racial hostility and the danger of mob violence. The courtroom was filled entirely with white townspeople. George's family wasn't there. They had been forced to flee town after his arrest, fearing for their lives. The prosecution's case was alarmingly thin. A verbal confession unrecorded, unsigned, no physical evidence, no forensic proof, no eyewitnesses. The jury, composed of 12 white men, took just 10 minutes to deliberate. 10 minutes. They returned with a unanimous verdict, guilty of murder in the first degree, with no recommendation of mercy. George was sentenced to die by electrocution. His execution date was set for June 16th, less than 2 months away. There were no appeals. No higher court reviewed the case. No clemency hearing was held. Outside the courtroom, few questioned the verdict. The Jim Crow South offered no space for doubt, especially when a black child stood accused of harming white girls. But decades later, legal scholars, activists, and human rights groups would revisit the case with horror. How could due process be so thoroughly ignored? How could a 14-year-old child be sent to the electric chair without proper defense? In a trial that lasted just hours, in 2014, 70 years after the execution, a South Carolina judge would call it what it was, a fundamental, constitutional injustice. But in 1944, there were no such words spoken, only the echo of a gavel and the sound of silence that followed. It was the night of June 15, 1944. Inside the Columbia State Penitentiary, George Stinney Jr. spent his final hours in a dark cell, alone. He was 14 years old. He wasn't allowed to see his parents. He wasn't allowed to speak to his siblings. His only visitors were guards and a Catholic priest, who prayed with him quietly into the night. Reports from that time say George cried, but never lashed out. He asked for his Bible. He asked if someone would tell his mother that he loved her, and in one of the most haunting details preserved in the prison's handwritten logs, George said this, "I'm scared." He weighed just 95 pounds. His feet didn't reach the floor when he sat in a chair, but the state of South Carolina prepared the electric chair all the same. They had to build a special booster seat, a Bible, according to some accounts, so that the straps would fit across his chest. George's final meal was ordinary fried chicken, collard greens, and a slice of cake. He didn't eat much of it. At sunrise, he was led from his cell. Guards walked slowly. George, they said, never resisted. He whispered short prayers. He looked around the prison corridor, as if still waiting for someone to speak up to stop it, to say this wasn't really happening. But no one came. No appeal. No stay of execution. No last-minute call. Just a child, walking toward a wooden chair far too big for his small body. June 16, 1944, 8:05 a.m. Columbia, South Carolina. Inside the execution chamber of the state penitentiary, the atmosphere was cold and clinical. Reporters stood in silence. Prison officials moved with solemn, practiced rhythm. And then, the doors opened. George Stinney Jr., just 14 years old, was led into the room by 2 guards. He was so small that the leather straps slipped from his wrists. His feet dangled above the floor when he sat in the chair. The guards struggled to fit the adult-sized headpiece onto his head. Witnesses recalled that the oversized mask slipped down over his face, covering nearly his entire neck and shoulders. No one said a word. George spoke briefly before the mask was lowered. "I'm innocent," he whispered. "I never did it. Tell my mother I love her." It was the last thing he would ever say. At 8:06 a.m., the switch was pulled. The first jolt lifted his small body from the chair. His fists clenched. The mask slipped further. Witnesses later described the smell of burning flesh and the faint sound of sobbing, but no one moved. 2 more jolts followed. By 8:10 a.m., George Stinney Jr. was declared dead. A boy not old enough to drive, vote, or sign a legal document had just been executed by the state of South Carolina, and with him, perhaps, so too died the last chance to ask, what if the system had been wrong? For decades, George Stinney Jr.'s name was barely a footnote in the archives of American justice. Just another case file, just another mugshot, just another execution. But time has a way of turning silence into a scream. In 2014, 70 years after his death, a South Carolina judge vacated George's conviction, declaring the original trial a great and fundamental injustice. The ruling didn't bring him back. It didn't erase the pain. But it did. Finally. Acknowledge what so many had whispered for years, that George Stinney Jr. may have been innocent. He was buried in an unmarked grave. No monument, no plaque. Only memory passed quietly through generations. His case has since become a symbol not just of wrongful execution, but of how fear, racism, and haste can corrupt the very institutions meant to protect us. It forces us to ask, what does justice mean when it fails a child? How many other names lost to time will never have their day in court? And if George Stinney Jr. had lived, what might he have become? Not a symbol, not a headline, not a martyr, just a boy